I took the contract because the money was right. That's the honest answer. Travel nursing pays well on a normal day, but when a facility is desperate, when they need bodies on a floor yesterday, the rates go up. My recruiter at the agency called it crisis rate. 13 weeks, night shift, med-surg unit at a community hospital outside of Bridgeport, Connecticut. The pay was almost double what I'd been making at my last assignment in Maryland. I didn't ask too many questions. My recruiter told me the basics. Bridgeport Memorial, a 200-bed community hospital, the 4th floor, a 32-bed medical surgical unit, had lost its entire nursing staff, not graduate, within a single week. 7 registered nurses, 4 CNAs, and the unit secretary had all resigned. Some gave 2 weeks' notice. Some didn't. One, I was told later, had walked off the floor mid-shift on a Tuesday and never came back for her personal belongings. It happens. Not often, and not usually that many at once, but it happens. A bad manager can poison a unit. Mandatory overtime. Unsafe patient ratios. A workplace culture that grinds people down until someone finally breaks and the rest follow. I'd seen it before at a hospital in Tucson. 3 nurses quit in a single weekend after a particularly bad incident with a combative patient. These things cascade. One person leaves and the workload gets worse for everyone else, so another person leaves, and so on. It's math more than mystery. That's what I told myself when I accepted the contract. I arrived on a Sunday in early March. The hospital was smaller than I expected. 2 main buildings connected by a glass-enclosed walkway, the older wing built in the 60s, the newer addition from sometime in the 90s. The 4th floor was in the older wing. I could tell it had been renovated at some point. New laminate flooring over what was probably old tile, fresh paint in that particular shade of gray-blue that every hospital in America has apparently agreed upon. But the bones of the building were old. The hallways were narrower than modern construction. The ceilings were lower. The rooms were smaller, arranged in a long, double-loaded corridor with the nurses' station roughly in the center. They had me shadow for 2 shifts before I was on my own. The day shift charge nurse was a woman named Denise who had been pulled from the ICU downstairs to manage the floor temporarily. She looked like she hadn't slept properly in weeks. During orientation, she walked me through the unit quickly, showed me the supply room, the clean utility, the Pyxis machine, the break room with its humming refrigerator and laminated sign about labeling your food. Ordinary things, she explained the charting system. They used Epic, which I was familiar with. She showed me the patient assignment board, a big whiteboard next to the nurse's station with room numbers, patient names, and nurse assignments written in dry erase marker. Most of the rooms are empty right now, she said. Census has been low since the staffing situation. They've been diverting admissions to the 3rd floor when they can, but we're getting new admits this week, so it'll pick up. I asked her, casually, what had happened with the previous staff. She looked at me for a moment, not with suspicion exactly, but with something measured. Then she said, it was a lot of things. Burnout, short staffing. It built up. I nodded. I'd heard that answer before at other hospitals about other units. It was always the same words. Burnout. Short staffing. It built up. Sometimes it was true. Sometimes it was the version of the truth that HR approved. My first week was uneventful. There were only 9 patients on the floor, spread across 32 rooms. Nights were quiet. I worked with one other travel nurse, a woman named Kayla from a different agency, and a CNA named Marcus who had been floated from the 2nd floor. We did our rounds, passed our meds, charted our assessments, and spent a lot of time sitting at the nurse's station under the fluorescent lights, listening to the building settle. Hospitals at night have a particular sound. Not silence. Never silence. There's always the ventilation system, the distant chime of an elevator, the intermittent beeping of an IV pump somewhere down the hall. Call lights ping at the nurse's station with a soft electronic tone. Doors latch and unlatch. The building breathes. You get used to it. You stop hearing it after a while, and then the quiet underneath becomes its own kind of sound. A low, constant hum that might be mechanical or might just be the noise your own ears make when there isn't enough in the world to listen to. It was on my 4th night that I noticed the first small thing. I was doing my midnight rounds. Checking on each patient, taking vitals on those who were due, making sure IV were running, that kind of thing. Room 409 was listed on the whiteboard as occupied. The patient name written there was Halloran, M. I hadn't taken report on anyone in 409. Kayla hadn't mentioned it either. But the room was listed. The name was written in the same blue dry erase marker as all the others, and there was a chart note in Epic for a patient named Margaret Halloran showing a nursing assessment from the previous shift. I walked down to 409. The door was closed, which wasn't unusual. Some patients preferred it. I knocked softly, the way you do at night when you don't want to wake someone but you need to check. No answer. I opened the door. The room was empty. The bed was made, not slept in and remade, but made the way housekeeping does it, with the sheets pulled tight and the pillow centered. The overhead light was off. The bathroom door was open, bathroom empty. No personal belongings. No water pitcher on the bedside table. No wristband. No patient. I went back to the nurse's station and checked Epic again. Margaret Halloran. Admitted 2 days prior. Diagnosis: pneumonia. The chart had a full history and physical, a set of admission orders, lab work, and nursing notes from day shift. The most recent note was from 1547 that afternoon. Patient resting comfortably. Lungs diminished bilateral bases. O2 at 2L via nasal cannula. No acute distress. But there was no one in the room. I mentioned it to Kayla. She pulled up the chart on her own screen, read the notes, and shrugged. Maybe she was discharged late and nobody updated the board. Or maybe she was transferred to another floor. It happens. It did happen. Late discharges, bed swaps, transfers that didn't get communicated across shifts. These were normal administrative failures. I made a note to ask Denise about it in the morning and moved on. Denise, when I asked, checked the system and told me Margaret Halloran had been discharged that afternoon. The board just didn't get updated. I'll take care of it. She erased the name from the whiteboard. That was that. Except it wasn't, because the discharge summary wasn't in the chart. I looked for it the next night, out of mild professional curiosity more than anything else. A discharge requires a physician's order, a discharge summary, patient education documentation, and usually a follow-up plan. None of that was in the chart. The last entry was still the day shift nursing note from 1547. After that, nothing. The chart just stopped as if Margaret Halloran had simply ceased to be a patient, not discharged, not transferred, not expired. Just absent. I filed it away in my mind. It bothered me, but it didn't alarm me. Hospital charting systems are imperfect. Records get misfiled, entries get lost during system updates, things fall through cracks. I've been a nurse for 11 years. I'd seen worse documentation failures. 2 nights later, 409 was occupied again. The whiteboard said Dwyer, R. Robert Dwyer, 71, admitted for a COPD exacerbation. I took report on him from the day nurse, a float from the 3rd floor whose name I've forgotten, and did my assessment. He was a thin, quiet man with an oxygen cannula and a paperback novel on his bed tray. We exchanged maybe 10 words. He asked me to close the door on my way out because the hallway light bothered him. Ordinary interaction. Ordinary patient. 3 days later, when I came in for my shift, Robert Dwyer was gone. The room was empty. The bed was made. No discharge summary in the chart. Transferred to the ICU, Marcus told me when I asked. Earlier today, I think. His O2 dropped. I checked. There was no transfer order. No ICU admission note referencing Robert Dwyer. No bed assignment for him on any other floor. I called the ICU and spoke to the charge nurse there. She said they hadn't received any transfer patient from the 4th floor that day. She checked the log to be sure. No Robert Dwyer. This time it did alarm me. Not because I thought something supernatural was happening. That wasn't where my mind went. I thought there was a documentation problem, possibly a serious one. If patients were being moved or discharged without proper charting, that was a safety issue. That was a liability. I wrote an incident report through the hospital's online reporting system, described the discrepancy, and submitted it. I never received a response. I never received an acknowledgement. When I checked the reporting system a week later, I couldn't find the report. The system showed no record of me having submitted anything. It was around this time that I started paying closer attention to the 4th floor. Not to 409 specifically, to all of it. The way the unit operated. The way information moved or didn't. I started writing things down in a small notebook that I kept in my scrub pocket because I was beginning to feel like the things I noticed one night were harder to recall clearly the next. Not forgotten. Exactly. Just softer, less certain. I'd remember noticing something odd, but couldn't quite reconstruct what it was. The notebook helped. Here are some of the things I wrote down over the next 2 weeks. A call light from room 412 went off 3 times during a single shift. Room 412 had no patient. I reset it each time. The 3rd time, I stood in the room for 5 minutes afterward, looking at the call light remote clipped to the bed rail. It was one of the old corded models, the kind with a single large button. I held it in my hand. The cord wasn't frayed. The button wasn't stuck. Nothing in the room was touching it. I unclipped it from the bed rail and set it on the windowsill, away from the bed. It didn't go off again that night. The next night, it was clipped back to the bed rail. I hadn't moved it back. I found a set of nursing notes in Epic that were timestamped at 0312 on a Wednesday, a time I had been on the floor, charting at the nurse's station. The notes were for a patient in room 404. They were entered under my login. They described a routine assessment, vitals within normal limits, patient sleeping, no complaints. The documentation was formatted the way I format my notes. The same abbreviations, the same order of information, but I hadn't written them. I had no memory of entering that room or performing that assessment. And when I walked down to 404, the room was empty. One night I counted the rooms during my rounds. There should have been 32 patient rooms on the floor, 16 on each side of the corridor. I counted 33. I went back and counted again. 32. I stood in the hallway for a long time, trying to figure out which room I had miscounted. I couldn't. The numbers on the doors went in order. 401, 402, 403... all the way to 4016 on one side, 4017 to 432 on the other. That's 32. But the first time I walked the hall, I am certain. I passed a door between 408 and 410 that was not 409. It was unmarked. It was closed. And on my second pass, it wasn't there. Room 409 was where it had always been, in the right sequence, with nothing between it and 408 but 12 feet of corridor wall. I know how this sounds. I know what you're thinking because I thought it too. I thought I was tired. I thought I was stressed. I thought the low census and the empty hallways and the nighttime quiet were getting to me the way they sometimes get to people who work alone in large, underpopulated spaces. Hospitals are disorienting environments even under the best circumstances. The lighting never changes. The temperature is constant. There are no windows in the interior corridors. Your circadian rhythm has nothing to anchor to. After enough nights, your sense of time softens. Things blur. I made an appointment with my primary care doctor back home, a telehealth visit, and described my symptoms without mentioning the specifics. Poor sleep, difficulty concentrating, memory gaps. She suggested I might be experiencing adjustment issues related to the new assignment and recommended I pay attention to my sleep hygiene. She offered to prescribe something to help me sleep during the day. I declined. I tried, once, to find one of the nurses who had quit. The hospital's HR department wouldn't give me any contact information, which I expected. But I found one through a mutual connection. A nurse who had worked at Bridgeport Memorial for 6 years, 3 of them on the 4th floor. Her name was Andrea. I sent her a message through Facebook and she agreed to talk on the phone, though she seemed reluctant. The conversation was short. Maybe 10 minutes. She was polite but guarded. When I told her I was working on the 4th floor, there was a pause, 3 or 4 seconds of nothing. "How long have you been there?" she asked. "About 5 weeks. Another pause. "And you're doing okay?" I told her I had some questions about the unit, about documentation issues, about room 409. "I really don't want to get into all of that," she said. Her voice was even, controlled. "Not scared. Tired." "I left because it wasn't a good fit anymore." That's what I told HR, and that's the truth. It just stopped being a place I wanted to be. I asked her if she'd ever noticed anything unusual with the charting, with patients appearing or disappearing without proper documentation. "I don't think I can help you," she said. "I hope the assignment goes well." Before she hung up, she said one more thing. It was quiet, almost like she was saying it to herself. "Don't chart in the rooms, just do your assessments and go back to the station to write them up. Don't sit in the rooms." I asked her what she meant. She said she had to go. The call ended. I don't chart in patient rooms. Most nurses don't. We do our assessments at the bedside and then return to the nurse's station or a workstation in the hallway to enter our notes. It's standard practice. But some nurses do document at the bedside, especially if they have a portable workstation. Andrea's comments seemed oddly specific, and I couldn't figure out what she was warning me about. I still can't. By the 6th week, I had started to feel something I can only describe as a shift in the texture of the floor. Not literally. The laminate didn't change. The walls didn't move. But the space felt different at certain times. Usually between 2 and 4 in the morning, during the deepest part of the night shift. The 4th floor took on a quality that I don't have a clinical word for. The air felt closer. The hallway seemed longer when I walked it, not dramatically so, but enough that my body noticed even if my mind tried to dismiss it. Like walking on a treadmill, movement without proportional progress. And the sounds changed, not in kind, but in behavior. The normal background noise of the hospital, the ventilation, the elevator chimes, the beeping would occasionally seem to organize itself. That's the only way I can describe it. Instead of random ambient noise, I would sometimes perceive a pattern, a rhythm, as if the building's mechanical systems were falling into sync with each other for brief periods. Aum, ashimi, aklik, aum, ashimi, aklik, lasting maybe 30 seconds, then dissolving back into randomness. I asked Marcus if he heard it. He looked at me funny and said, "Heard what?" I asked Kayla. She said, "The building's old. Old buildings make weird noises." But Kayla quit 2 weeks later. She didn't finish her contract. She told the agency she'd found a better assignment, which might have been true. The night before her last shift, she was quiet. We were sitting at the nurse's station around 3 in the morning. She was staring at her screen, not typing. Then she said, without looking at me, "Do you ever check a room and feel like someone just left?" I said yes. She nodded. She didn't say anything else about it. She finished her shift, and I never saw her again. They sent a replacement, another travel nurse, a man named Derek who was efficient and professional and who didn't seem to notice anything unusual about the floor. He lasted 3 weeks before he also transferred out. His reason, as far as I know, was that he didn't like nights. I was there for 9 weeks total. I should have stayed for 13. Here's what happened on the night I decided to leave. It was a Thursday. We had 11 patients on the floor, which was the highest census since I'd arrived. I was halfway through my 1 o'clock rounds. I'd checked rooms 401 through 408 and was walking toward 409. There was a patient in 409 that night, a woman named Gladys Okafor, 83, admitted for a UTI and dehydration. I'd assessed her at the start of my shift. She was alert, oriented, pleasant. She'd asked me to bring her a ginger ale, which I did. I knocked on the door of 409 and opened it. The room was dark except for the light from the hallway spilling in through the doorway. Gladys was in bed, lying on her side, facing the wall. I could see the shape of her under the blanket, the rise and fall of her breathing. Normal. But there was someone sitting in the chair by the window. Hospitals have visitor chairs in every room. Vinyl cushioned chairs, usually beige or maroon. They sit next to the bed or by the window. At 1 a.m, no one should have been sitting in that chair. Visiting hours ended at 8. The chair should have been empty. It was not empty. Someone was sitting in it. I could see the shape. A person sitting upright, hands in their lap, facing the bed, not moving. I reached for the light switch by the door. The overhead fluorescence flickered on. The room flooded with that flat, humming clinical light. The chair was empty. I stood in the doorway for what felt like a full minute, looking at the chair. It was pushed back slightly from where it usually sat, as if someone had shifted it. The vinyl seat cushion had a depression in it. Slight, but visible. The kind of impression a person's weight would leave. Gladys stirred. She blinked at the light and looked at me. "Ah," she said. "I thought you already came in." "No," I said. "This is my first round." She looked confused. "Not disoriented." She was cognitively intact, I'd assessed that. Confused in the specific way of someone trying to reconcile two pieces of information that don't match. "Someone was just in here," she said. "A few minutes ago. They checked my IV." I looked at her IV. It was running. The drip rate was correct. The tubing was untangled. Everything was in order. But I hadn't been in the room yet, and no one else on the floor had reason to check on her at that time. "Do you remember what they looked like?" I asked. She thought about it. "A nurse. They were wearing scrubs, dark ones, I think. They didn't say much. Just checked the line and left." She paused. "No, they didn't leave. They sat down." "Sat down where?" "In the chair. Right there." She pointed at the empty chair by the window. "They sat down and they were just sitting there. I think I fell asleep for a bit. And then you came in. I checked her vitals. Everything was normal. I told her to rest and I turned off the light and closed the door. I walked back to the nurse's station and sat down and looked at my hands for a while. They were steady. My pulse was normal. I felt calm in the way you feel calm when something fundamental has shifted and your body hasn't caught up yet. I opened Epic and pulled up Gladys Okafor's chart. I wanted to see if someone else had documented an assessment that I hadn't been aware of. Maybe a float nurse from another floor had come up to help, though I hadn't seen anyone. There was a note, time-stamped 0047, 16 minutes before I'd entered the room. It was a nursing assessment. Vitals. I4 check. Patient resting comfortably. Routine. Unremarkable. It was entered under my login. I read it 3 times. I read my own name at the top of the note. I recognized the formatting. The abbreviations. The sentence structure. It was the way I chart. It was, in every identifiable way, a note that I had written. But I hadn't written it. At 0047, I had been in room 406, changing an IV bag for a patient with a potassium drip. I knew this because I had charted that note myself, the real note, the one I actually wrote, at 0051. I sat there for a long time. Then I opened my notebook and looked at the entries from previous weeks. The notes I'd flagged as entered under my login that I had no memory of writing. There were 7 of them. All for rooms on the east side of the corridor. All time-stamped between midnight and 4 a.m. All formatted in my style. All describing routine assessments on patients who, in 2 cases, I later couldn't confirm had ever been in those rooms. I closed the notebook. I closed the chart. I finished my rounds. I did not go back into room 409 for the rest of the shift, even though I should have. I let Marcus do the 4 o'clock check. He didn't report anything unusual. At the end of the shift, I drove back to my extended stay hotel. I sat on the bed and called my agency. I told my recruiter I wanted to end the contract early. She asked me why. I said the assignment wasn't a good fit. She was disappointed but professional. She said she'd make the arrangements. My last shift was that Sunday. On my final night, I cleaned out my locker in the break room and turned in my temporary badge. Denise was on the floor, though she was supposed to have been off that night. She looked the same way she'd looked on my first day. Tired, measured, professional. "I'm sorry it didn't work out," she said. "Can I ask you something?" I said. She waited. "How long have you worked here?" 14 years. "Has the fourth floor always had staffing problems?" She looked at me with an expression I've thought about many times since. It wasn't evasive. It wasn't defensive. It was the expression of someone who has come to a private conclusion about something and has decided that sharing it would serve no practical purpose. A kind of settled resignation. "Every floor has staffing problems," she said. "That's not what I asked." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The fourth floor has always been hard to keep staffed. It was like that before I started here. Some units are just like that. The layout, the patient population, the way it feels at night. Some nurses do fine here. Most don't stay long. Does anyone ever talk about the charting issues, the documentation that appears under people's logins?" Something changed in her face. Just slightly. A tightening around the eyes that passed quickly. "I'd recommend you raise any documentation concerns with the informatics team. They handle system issues. I filed an incident report about it. It disappeared from the system." She held my gaze. "I'm sorry you had a difficult experience. I hope your next assignment is better." She shook my hand. Her grip was firm and brief. She went back to the nurses' station. I drove away from Bridgeport Memorial at 7:15 in the morning with the sun coming up over the parking garage. I didn't look at the building in my rearview mirror. I didn't feel relief, exactly. I felt like I had stepped back from an edge that I couldn't see the bottom of. I took 2 weeks off before my next assignment. I slept poorly, which wasn't unusual after a night shift rotation. I had dreams, but not nightmares. In the dreams, I was doing rounds in an empty hospital. The hallways were long and fluorescent lit, and I was checking rooms, one after another, and each room was empty but recently occupied. Warm sheets, dented pillows, water glasses with condensation still beating on the sides. The impression of presence without the presence itself. My next assignment was at a hospital in Pennsylvania. A bigger facility, well-staffed, day shift, normal. The unit was bright and busy and full of the ordinary chaos of a functioning medical floor. I felt better almost immediately. The tight feeling in my chest that I'd been carrying for weeks loosened and faded. 3 weeks into the new assignment, I was charting at a hallway workstation, documenting an assessment on a patient in room 312. Routine. I saved the note and moved on to my next patient. That evening, while I was finishing up my end-of-shift documentation, I reviewed my notes from the day, the way I always do before clocking out. There was an assessment note for a patient in room 308, timestamped 1014-23. I had been on my lunch break at 1014-23. I hadn't been on the floor. The note was entered under my login. It was formatted in my style. It described a routine assessment on a patient I had never seen. Vitals within normal limits. Patient resting comfortably. No acute distress. I stared at the screen. The fluorescent lights hummed above me. Somewhere down the hall, a call light chimed. I closed the chart. I looked at my hands. They were steady. I haven't told anyone about this. I don't know what I would say. I don't know what's happening to me, or whether something is happening to me, or whether something happened to me on the fourth floor that is still happening. I don't know if the fourth floor was the cause, or if it simply made me aware of something that was already there, something in the system, in the charting, in the rhythm of the work itself, a pattern that I wasn't supposed to notice. I still nurse. I still do my rounds. I still chart my assessments in the same format I've always used, with the same abbreviations, in the same order. And sometimes, when I pull up a patient's chart, I find a note that I don't remember writing. It's always routine, always unremarkable, always entered during a time I can account for, a time when I was somewhere else, doing something else, being someone who hadn't yet learned to be afraid of her own handwriting in a medical record. I've started keeping the notebook again. I write down what I do, room by room, minute by minute. I check it against the charts at the end of every shift. Most nights, everything matches. Some nights, it doesn't. On those nights, I sit in my car in the parking lot after my shift and wait for the sun to come up. I don't drive in the dark anymore. I don't trust the time between midnight and 4 in the morning. I don't trust the quiet. I don't know what was on the 4th floor. I don't know if it was ever just on the 4th floor. I don't know if the other nurses who quit are finding notes under their names in systems they no longer have access to. I don't know if Andrea was trying to warn me or protect me or simply tell me the one thing she'd figured out before she left. Don't chart in the rooms. I don't know what that means. I've thought about it for months. I think maybe she was saying that when you sit in those rooms, when you stay in them, when you open the system in them, something notices. Something that works in the margins of documentation. Something that exists in the space between what you did and what the record says you did. I don't know. I don't know if that's true or if I've constructed a meaning where there isn't one because the alternative, that there is no pattern, no cause, no reason, is worse. The last thing I'll say is this. 2 nights ago, I was at home, not at a hospital. I was sitting at my kitchen table reading, drinking tea. My phone was on the counter. I hadn't touched it in over an hour. At 0247, I received an automated email notification from the Epic system at Bridgeport Memorial. The kind of notification you get when a chart you're associated with is updated. A nursing assessment note had been entered for a patient on the 4th floor, room 409, time-stamped 0243. It was entered under my login. My credentials at Bridgeport Memorial were deactivated 11 weeks ago. I didn't open the notification. I turned off my phone. I sat at my kitchen table and listened to the house and waited for the sun to come up. It's up now. I'm writing this down because Andrea was right about one thing. You should keep your own records. Somewhere outside the system. Somewhere that can't be edited or overwritten or added to while you're sleeping. I don't know who else is charting under my name. I don't know if it's a who. I don't think it matters. What matters is that somewhere, in a hospital I no longer work at, in a room I will never enter again, something is documenting assessments on patients I have never met, in my voice, in my style, in my name. And every note says the same thing. Patient resting comfortably. No acute distress.